to thank you for this, for the start of the meeting, because it fits so well. Because I think I'm talking about, just thinking about what am I going to say now. I realize that it's really very much about children some children who feel a connection between the home or the social environment and the school, but others who actually cannot recognize themselves in the school environment and disconnect or unhinge from that school environment. Or the other way around, some children think they should disconnect from their families, their communities, in order to be successful in the schools or in the wider society beyond their families. So how do children navigate these different worlds that they sometimes experience, which is often the case, particularly for migrant children. So let me first introduce myself. My name is Sandra J. I work at VU University Amsterdam, and I was supposed to be here with Sandra J, but unfortunately she had some serious family problems, so at last minute she couldn't make it. So I had to sort of be her, but I can't be her, so I'm trying to tell you a bit about two pilot studies. One that I did with former students of ours, Marie Coy, and another study that Sandra J did last year, that I'm trying to present a bit of that for her. So let me start then. I'm chairing the Anthropology of Children and Youth network in Europe, which is part of the European Association for Social Anthropology as a network. And we actually, like when we started 6-7 years ago, we were sort of advocating a bit, indeed what's just been pointed out, the importance of children as indeed navigating many other worlds than just the school environment. They contribute economically, politically, socially, and culturally. And it would be a pity not to look at that. I think we miss out on a lot of knowledge that we actually, as adults, but also children themselves, can benefit from. I'm actually an anthropologist, but started working also with neuroscientists and people in education, and see whether we could not build bridges between disciplines, anthropology being very qualitative, and particularly neuroscience being quantitative. Particularly, I had this bewildering conversation where I met the neuroscientist, and we discovered that we both were working with children. And he said, yeah, well, actually, what age? Oh, yeah, and it turned out that his research method is putting children in a scan. And I was just like blown away. And he said, yeah, well, what methods are you using then? Oh, actually, I just hang out with them, which seemed utterly unscientific to him. Which, in the meantime, I've learned a bit more about his discipline. I can totally understand why he thought this is really not done. But anyway, luckily, I convinced him to no longer put children in the scan because there are other methods available. So we learn a bit from each other. And then a colleague of his, Lydia Krabbendam, was even daring to go a bit further and to develop a joint research program between neuroscientists, psychologists, and anthropologists, and which luckily got funded on indeed the question of how culture influences brain processes as well, and that children are more than just their brains, just like we are. So, and from that research, we discovered a lot of interest between us on code switching of children. Children indeed navigating different worlds, different settings, in which they, different skills, different values and norms are shared with children. Children share them and build them together with parents and the wider society. So we decided to focus on that code switching. Code switching originally is very much a linguistic kind of concept, switching between different languages. So every time I say we work on code switching, people say, oh, it's so bilingual children. But actually, we focus much more on children who navigate not just different language worlds, or linguistic worlds, but also different social cultural worlds. Indeed, how do they navigate very different expectations between the school environment and the home environment? And what if these differences become so far apart in their experiences that it's always they have to make a choice? And which seems to be happening a lot. And I want to introduce two pilot studies we did because this program is just starting. One is taking place in Mauritius, and the other one is taking place in the Netherlands. Very different settings, but we look at underlying dynamics of code switching, of children confronted with these divergent worlds of those of the schools and those of their social environments. And particularly since most of the work on code switching is so much about language, that we try to look more at, it's not between different cultures, because culture of course flows, and sometimes it's described as, you know, children who navigate between different cultures. But that's of course misleading, because it's much more mixed. But there are certain cultural anchorings between the school system, neoliberal habit, what we've just heard already before, and anchorings, cultural anchorings that children have in school, maybe more collective approaches to life, and that life is indeed more than just school. And that's also important for survival, but also for who you are as a person. So we focus on three identifiers: location, language, and people, and I will just say a bit more about that. Location is identifier of physical differences between locations, like the neighborhood or the home and the school, which sometimes are actually demarcated areas with fences and so on, depending where exactly you are. Language, of course, is part of code switching as well, but also people. People are very important, of course, in where particularly switching or children who are at ease with where they are, where this is changing. We've used very different methods, and we are developing these methods. Some of these methods we've tested out in the pilots, and I would like to highlight a few to show you what that did for us, so to say. Participant observation turned out to be really important. Like most of the schools that I visited, they well, actually had these bewildering conversations with principals who said, "Where's your questionnaire?" And I said, "Well, actually, I don't have a questionnaire." And then, well, and you call yourself a scientist, which indeed I heard in the past. So I came up with questionnaires, but actually didn't do much with them, just to get interest and to be accepted in the, you know, as a real researcher and not just as a wannabe researcher. So these are interesting things we developed, but particularly I hang around with them in their houses, with their families, in the streets, depending on what they want to be doing that day. And that turned out to be really fruitful, because you discover that school is just really marginal in what else they have going on. They have so much going on, and school is just actually deviating them a bit from their life plans. And the question is, does school really help them to realize these life plans? So here, this is just a sample of what we've called an intermediality chart, in which we look at different, you know, areas of where children get information from. This is, of course, not exhaustive in any way, but I'm just highlighting a few today. And if you see the outside circle is sort of the influences, and the circle is having both two aspects. It's actually the outside world, how children are embedded in wider environments, and how through their senses they also mediate different information, and in their brains they construct knowledge and positionings. That is, of course, not just a brain process, but it's indeed in the wider world of people mediating messages to them, they mediating messages and knowledge also themselves. So that's very much between, you know, the individual and the wider environment. I think that's very important to look at that. So let me start with the first setting in which we did try out, pilot this kind of research. And that was in Mauritius, among migrants. Everybody in Mauritius is migrants. But we focused particularly on a group of migrant children who are called, who call themselves Chagosians. Do you know where the Chagos Islands are? Do you know where Diego Garcia is? Well, in Diego Garcia, there's one of the most American military bases, and all the operations in Iraq and Afghanistan are operated from this particular base in the Indian Ocean. And at the end of the 1960s, beginning of the 1970s, the population living in these areas, in these islands, it's an agriculture, had to be removed in order to make space for this military base, because the Americans demanded. The territory was part of British overseas territory, and the Americans wanted to lease it under condition that it would be an area without civilians. So people living there had to be removed, and they were re-stationed or reinstalled to islands, the Seychelles Islands and Mauritius, and we focused our research on Mauritius. And of course the parents, particularly the grandparents of these, the grandchildren that we worked with, are advocating to go back to the Chagos Islands, but it doesn't look like they can go back anywhere near in the future because this base indeed is so important to the Americans. And in the meantime, the area around the base has been labeled as being recently, Brown was the Prime Minister of England, saying that this is the biggest, now the biggest marine park. Well, conservationists usually don't like people very much either. So the thing is, in the sense that they prefer them to stay away from biodiversity. So this was another hassle for them in order to realize the dream of return. But indeed, immediate messages of home being Chagos and not the Seychelles, not the Seychelles and surely not Mauritius, because you have to realize that Mauritius became independent at that same time. And the deal was, Mauritius was also part of British territory, but Mauritius became independent under condition that although Mauritius and the Chagos were part of the same overseas British territory, but Mauritius would become independent and the Chagos Islands would remain British. With this consequence that eventually this became an American base and the Chagosians lost islands. So they were actually housed in Mauritius where they feel they lived among the people who betrayed them. So you feel that very much that is also the message that elderly and their parents of the children mediate with these children, that we don't belong here. Which is also reinforced by Mauritius society. It's very often called Little India. It looks very Indian, and the majority of inhabitants is from Indian descent, and they are actually very dominant in the education system, also in the media, and that is something that children pick up on. I should say that the areas where these children live are challenging areas. There's lots going on also in terms of economic hardship, fragmented families, parents are often not together, so it's a very challenging environment for them. And they describe it as, and I use the words that they use, as sorrow, sadness, and misery and poverty. But indeed that echoes also messages that the parents and grandparents give to them. They say, well, actually, you're not going to stay in Mauritius. Actually, yeah, you go to school, but well, if you don't feel like it, you don't have to go because it doesn't help you. You're going to live in this paradise one day, which are the Chagos Islands. And the children speak of the Chagos Islands as paradise, as a place where they will belong one day, and where they will be together with the wider family groups, who are fragmented between Seychelles and Mauritius. The reality is that the children indeed have big economic responsibilities in their families. They take care of siblings, etc., etc. So they have important roles to play in many ways. And in Mauritius, they fall also in a bit of a marginalized category of about the minority of people, is what is called Creoles. So their ancestors have a background in Africa and Madagascar, and they worked both in Mauritius and on the Chagos Islands as slaves. And these are the descendants of these slaves. And they have a marginalized position in Mauritius. So they also have to deal with these dynamics. I work with photo elicitation and just send the children, ask them whether they would like photographing the place where they live. And this is one of the neighborhoods where they live, and you see that in the rain season they actually have a whole system where in the dry season they sleep on the ground, but in the rain season they sleep, they put sort of cupboards, and they sleep in cupboards a bit higher so they can sleep above the water level, as this water is there for sometimes several weeks on end. And this is the kind of dwellings they live in. So their life in Mauritius is very much juxtaposed to the life that is waiting for them in the Chagos. So none of them speaks of a military base in Chagos because their parents simply don't have room in their discourses for any negative possibilities or realities in the Chagos Islands. And I also used together with Mariko, who did this research together with me, the we used also a drawing elicitation, but we used a method in which we didn't take the interpretation of the drawings. The children themselves talked about these drawings for hours on end. On anything under the sun. Sometimes nothing to do with these drawings anymore, but we kept on listening patiently. But this is somebody describing, you know, our life is begging, and these are children begging in the streets. And actually, as this drawing was discussed, the blue pencil was seen in the hand. Said, oh well, actually they're smiling, and it's not funny, so I should change it. So they changed it. So they talked about their livelihoods very much. Which, and this is an image of, you know, what life would be like in Chagos, where they list the names of the people that they do not live with anymore because they live in Seychelles, and that who will live with them once they are back in Chagos. So, and indeed this also represents a big family reunion where you see the elderly people walking with canes back together. They're now unhappy, and one day they will be back in Chagos. So what does this have to do with education? So we did this research in primary schools, in particularly neighborhoods, as I just described, where most children are Creole, and some children also Indian descent, but most children of Indian descent go to other better schools. So these are the schools where you really don't prefer to be in, only when you have to, and that is the case with Creole children living in these areas. They called ZEP schools zone indication prioritaire, so they are zones, schools that are listed as less than 40% of children in these schools pass primary school exam. So, and you see that teachers are surviving there. They are allocated a job there for 3 years, and then they move on to a better school. So they're surviving, and literally they divide the class between the children who they have some hope for, the children who might be able to make the first heavy exam of the end of primary school, and those who actually don't stand a chance. And it's interesting that this is done totally along ethnic lines. So the Creole children are already put aside as hopeless. And when I started talking the kind of methods I wanted to, after, you know, the teachers thinking I come in with a questionnaire, and I said, well, actually, I was thinking of something else with my crayons and things that I came in, and paper, and I said, well, actually, I'm going to ask them to draw about their lives, and I had some specific questions. So. But, and she said, well, they can't do that, they're just not intelligent enough for this kind of thing. We teach them how to copy, so they actually could beautifully copy, you know, images, but they were never asked to draw upon themselves in creativity or think whatever they wanted to draw. So teachers propose sometimes, you know, come back in a few weeks and prepare them so they will be able to do it maybe, but maybe not. So I said, well, just let them draw, and it was amazing because teachers themselves discovered possibilities in these children that they'd never thought of. Like they could do the job, and they had all these stories to tell. Many teachers discovered actually that these Creoles are not just one generic categories, but they're actual children with lives outside the schools and with his histories. They had a past, and some linked their history back to Africa, but some linked their history back to Chagos. And some teachers didn't even know about Chagos. So it was really interesting to see these teachers also thinking, you know, these are opportunities. And you see something else is that teachers started using this method in their teaching after we'd left. So this was really something of an eye-opener for everybody. But these teachers, as I said, have very challenging jobs because they have to try to learn the children something. But at the same time, they are really sort of little islands school in these neighborhoods. There are huge fences around it, and children are literally body checked for knives and other equipment they might use in the school to harm other people. So you get these body searches of these very young children in the school. They enter the school, and then the director is, yeah, we have to keep society out. But it's inside the children, and that's exactly what you see, because the children constantly, they work with what they know from also different mediations of different people that are very much outside these walls. And literally parents, if you hang out with the parents, they say, well, we never go into the school because we are not even allowed to. So there's very little connection. So for example, when a child has a problem in the school, what parents do, they send an elder sibling to come in and talk for them. So they very much don't want anything to do with the school, which is indeed a bit of a contradiction with one of the Indian Mauritian children who get after school classes, who are reinforced by their teachers, you know, and by their parents. So you have all these, you know, these possibilities for them. So, and also representation of children is very important. The teachers in the school are virtually all Indian Mauritian, which indeed mediates something to children. Children very quickly picked up on that. Like, look, did you ever see a Creole teacher? So why would I even try? There's no chance that I can ever do something meaningful. So they very much internalize this idea that they cannot perform, that they get from the home, in the sense that, you know, the school is really not the place that will bring them further. And they also feel that from the system itself. Also, when you study the curriculum, for example, then the Indian Mauritian feast, particularly the Hindu feast, are very clearly described as, and with all the costumes, and it's all very clearly in the curriculum. But then you read where there is on the Creole, they're basically presented as former slaves and as drum players. So you see very clearly that the curriculum is also reinforcing some of these stereotypes that children pick up on, like this boy, and this is really about code switching. He drew this drawing about India, and he knew everything about India. So he started talking about India. This is where the question for this assignment was, draw the place where the grandparents of your grandparents come from. He drew India and started talking about India. And as he was talking, the teacher was just looking at us, and then trying to, because we had some incidents before, I said, if I'm talking to the students, even if they lie, let them go for it. Tell me afterwards. She said, don't jump in. So I saw this teacher sitting, and he was just steaming away as this boy just kept on talking and talking. And all of a sudden he couldn't resist, so he barged in and said, he's lying, he's lying, he's lying. Look at the guy, he's clearly a Creole, so he cannot be from India. Wow. And the boy was not faced anyway. He just kept on talking India. Where was the place where his grandparents came from? And he kept on talking, and after a while he said, okay, this was it. So he walked away, looked over his shoulder, eyes shining beautifully, and said, well, they're not really from India, but it would be nice. So he really felt that it would be better to be from India. And this was a very beautiful example of a boy who really was a cultural navigator. I really knew his background. I visited his home, and he fluently went through everything. And he has a great sense of humor. In the school, he did whatever he wanted. He made jokes. As the one Creole child, he took Hindi lessons, because there were, of course, only Hindi lessons in the school that you could take. And they're of course, all Indian Mauritian children taking these classes. And he was taking them too. So and nobody understood why he took them, but he understood, like, being able to say certain words in Hindi to the teacher, it's interesting. So he really knew how to accumulate knowledge that could further his aims. And it was beautiful to see that. And he very clearly understood the differences and he knew how we could also mobilize them and work with them. Whereas so other children really getting discouraged and saying in, not totally directly in the beginning, but when hanging out with them, saying like it's either or I am Chagosian with my parents and I go to Chagos, or I try to be more Mauritian than the Mauritians and try to go to England, because under certain circumstances the Chagosian people can get an English-British passport. So they thought, you know, that maybe, particularly boys had that strategy, maybe I can go to England and make it there. But then it doesn't do me no good to be begging in the streets, that I should learn a lot and should do my best. And then I can go to England and get a mobile phone or even a motorcycle. So they had these fantasies of, you know, of life strategies. But then they felt they had to make a choice between their parents and different worlds. So you saw that language was a very important demarcation between these two, you know, geographical settings, as I described the neighborhood and the school, which was clearly demarcated by the gate, so to say. And then languages that you know, in the school, the language of instruction was English, and very often that was also a challenge for the Creole children who had parents who poorly mastered English. So there was a big challenge there. They often spoke English also to their siblings and not Creole. So they had the strategies to improve their English by speaking to their peers and siblings in English instead of Creole. Parents themselves had disrupted school reading trajectories, and as I said, parents having little faith in the educational system. And this disconnection became something so obvious between the school and well, what's so interesting is what we said, that they had a program of building bridges. Indeed, the rhetoric was all there. Building bridges between community and school. But there was not much more than that, because I said, what does it mean? Well, actually, teachers were scared to go into the community because then we might get knifed on the way there. So it was more a wonderful idea, but they were scared of their wits to actually implement it. So you saw, you know, this. And the ministry had told them that this was the way to go because it came from international, you know, organizations, and you know, it's a good idea to connect with community. We had no idea how actually establish this kind of connection. Probably we should use the children or work with the children who would constantly move between these two settings, so to say. Well, in the school, Creole is really not done, although children, of course, do not only use English in schools. They use different Hindi, they use Creole in the playground, but in class you really cannot speak anything else but English. There was a lot of connection, which I really found an eye-opener in the class itself. Like the teachers and the Indian descent children, they understood each other already almost. Without the language, it was not so much language, it's more the connectors about what's important, you know, culturally important, in family important, marriage politics. They joked about it, for example. There's a lot of joking between teachers. Whereas teachers are quite strict, but they did joke about, you know, like, is your sister already married now? Things like that. So they felt there was some communitas there. There was some link there, which I didn't see between the Creole children and the teachers at all. And that Indianness of how great it is to be Indian is constantly reinforced in the media. There's lots of Bollywood movies shown all the time on television, and also in the curriculum. This is reinforced, and also in society you see temples everywhere, and it came very clearly out in the drawings and so on, and what children said. So what we did, we started studying children's networks. What networks do children have inside the school, but also outside the school? Who do they hang out with? And you know, what languages do they use? What cultural, you know, assets do they use in what kind of settings? Do they switch, or is it just they move from one to the other? How can you demarcate such moments, and how are children aware of it? Well, usually they are not really aware of it. There were some exceptions, but usually it came without saying. The problem was that we discovered for some it did come without saying, but for others it was a huge challenge. And so this pilot really inspired us to implement similar kind of research in the Netherlands. So I want to say a bit about that. I have to watch the time a bit. So what I really want to underline here is that teachers discovered more about community through us talking to the children, and the children talking about their lives, as it was much bigger than in the gates. There was a life outside the gates, and that they were Chagosians, some of them, and they said, we are not just Creole, we are Chagosians, and we are going to Chagos, and they were proud of that. And which is quite interesting, because this was something that teachers could mobilize to see children that they are, their aspect of who they are, that actually it can be reinforced, that is positive, and they hear so much negative. So it's really something that teachers started working with. Like they started, some students were asked to give a presentation about Chagos in class, which they had never done presentations of pupils in class before. So they thought, you know, this is something that I brought up as an idea, and they thought, well, let's give it a try. So you saw these teachers also thirsty for it, actually, for other ways of getting to the, of course, the primary school exam is really what they aim for, but that they could make connections to the children, and that actually could help them to also come to this exam. That they started sort of wanting to look for possibilities together with us. Sometimes things didn't work at all. Other things, and we asked the children like why is it so boring? They found it always so boring because it's constantly repeating. They're drilled in information. So the teacher says something, the kids repeat it, and it had nothing to do with begging in the streets or what some of the children's life was like. So what sense does it make to know that 3 times 3 is 9 when when give them some money and let them calculate the money, for example. They knew a lot about that. So there were other methods that maybe could make the connection better by knowing more about their life outside the school. Now, totally different setting, but at the same time frame, interestingly enough, when the Chagos Islands were emptied from their population. In the Netherlands, there was a huge flow of migrants from Morocco and from Turkey coming into the country to work in factories, to actually cheap, unschooled labor from the poor areas of Morocco and Turkey to move into the Netherlands to take on jobs in the Netherlands. And what was, now we were talking about 3rd generation children who live in schools and in areas where, like this research that was taken on by Sandra J. I just explained that she couldn't make it. And she did this amazing work in an area where over 80% of the population is coming from Morocco and from Turkey, is Muslim. But it's the golden kid we refer to it. And the children's restrictions of the movement between what they can do in the home and do in the school was amazingly different for the children. And already the neighborhood sort of gives you, the children live in these higher buildings, whereas the center of the neighborhood is a huge church, whereas over 80% of them is Muslim. And there's no mosque in the area, so they have to go away to another area in order to be able to. But this church is empty basically, because even the few people of Dutch people, Dutch, to refer to the terminology that the children are using, they haven't moved out, so the church is not going to see any people anywhere soon entering their walls. But it's a very, very sort of important marker into in the area. Now, the schools in this area are listed as weak. Again, this Dutch system is also very much oriented on tests. So on tests, these schools are doing very lousy, and the children are indeed, and I think that was really pointed out by you so clearly, the children are seen as a problem that needs to be fixed. And the way of doing that is in the schools and through schooling, and a particular kind of schooling, which indeed maybe has very little to do with the lives they lead outside the school. And we use the method, which Sarah particularly used this method of what we've called tiered elicitation. So the children, we noted that they were aware in the sense that there was a huge difference between home and school. And they say it's just so different, and you cannot understand it's just so different. And yes, so different in what way? And they just couldn't tell us. So language was not going to get us anywhere. So they made these theater plays on these differences, play it out. Norms and rules that apply at home, that apply in school, and they played it out. And then they talked about it, and which turned out to be really a wonderful method. But what also was alarming, that these children also said something which I'd heard in Mauritius, which was the either or. Either I become really Dutch to make it in Dutch society, and I probably have to change my name because my name is Mohammed, and that's difficult when I go into the labor market. So I have this sort of strategy thinking, that either you do the school system or you really, you go back to Morocco or Turkey, like their grandparents are still doing. They never came around to go back, but that is the place where I'm valued as a Muslim outside the Netherlands. Whereas the Netherlands, of course, is this beautiful multicultural society where everybody has a right to be who they are. But these children clearly found this was not totally the case, and that there were choices to be made in life. And I would say that almost the first signs of unhinging, either from the home or from the school. Yeah, there's a lot of theory which actually I'm not so interested in sharing with you, because I'm just more interested in letting the children say a few things more. What abilities they drew upon to be able to indeed navigate these worlds, and increasingly having trouble navigating these worlds. And again, I take an example just as I did in the Chagos, among the Chagosian children. This is Dunya, this is a girl who really got it, the code switching down. She was really aware of it. But she also knew who she was, in the sense that she was different from the Dutch, she always said. So this is an interview that Sarah did, or a discussion, it's very informal, with Dunya, who said, "Miss, are you a Dutch woman?" "Yes." "And you are right, you're too right. You live here." "Yes, that's true, but I'm not a real Dutch woman." So these children constantly make these distinctions and work with that as well in their positionings. And this girl, she mastered like various languages, and she also, her friends were Turkish and Moroccan, and she said, "If I want to go to their houses, the parents, they only speak Turkish, only speak Moroccan, so I have to learn the language to be able to speak to these people, so I have to make the effort, and I want to make that effort." So she taught herself. There were no classes for it, so she really took it on herself to do that, and she really did a lot of translation between people. She mediated a lot also for adults who couldn't speak to each other, like the parents of her friend and her parents couldn't speak to each other, or broken Dutch. So she mediated, and very easily she often had to go to the doctors with her mother, and then she mediated between the doctor and her mother. So she really knew how to do that. And indeed, these children had very elaborate networks outside the schools also. For example, in the mosque, which was a lot further, was not even in the area, it was outside the area. So they took classes there, homework classes, for example, which were very important to them because they felt they belonged there. They always talked about belonging. It's very important to realize. The Chagosians didn't belong in Mauritius, and many children in the Netherlands in these schools felt the way they didn't really belong in the Netherlands. It was something that came out so often, and that was really tricky. And what was really amazing to see for them was, in the Dutch schooling, children have to be assertive, they have to be individuals, they have to speak up and look the professor in the eye. Now, lots of these children should never look an adult in the eye. That's what they taught in the home. And now all of a sudden in the school they have to look in the eye, as well as respecting the teaching. You don't look away, you look in the eye. And the first word that the Dutch children learn in school is I. And they make this booklet about I and, but there's always I at the center. Which indeed, the messages they get at home is very often now children are there to be seen, not to be heard. So, very different. So, and that's exactly what parents very often said, was they become so rude. The school teaches them how to be rude. They don't respect us anymore. They don't respect our religion. They don't respect our ways. And the school is actually encouraging that kind of behavior. So the disconnect there between school and home was also quite visible. And children in between that, they have to face the parents at the end of the day. But the next morning they have to face the teacher again, and they have to be able to manage there. So we looked at these various personal variables and also the wider embedded personal, which I've listed a few, the linguistics, their background, the coding, and how they, some had more difficulty with it. We clearly saw different groups. I'm always scared to put children in groups, but different ways of this navigation between these cultural anchoring, so to say. And the social environment was crucial to be able to understand what children did in the school, why they did certain things, why they had difficulty with these tests, that it was not intelligence, that there were other factors at play, and there was not their brain functioning poorly either, because they were often highly intelligent, particularly emerging these kind of different worlds and surviving the experience. And staying in harmony with both the school and the home, which was a real huge challenge for them. I was so impressed with the children that they managed to not get into huge conflicts at home and huge conflicts in the school, because it was so different. They said right at the beginning, it's different, and that's really something that was clear, looking at how they navigated that. So we had these locations as physical difference. It's really important to also look at how they were housed. You know, some of these children, they slept in bunker beds we were placed before the windows because otherwise it didn't fit. You know, it's so important to know. And then in the school, where the school was huge compared to where they lived, and it's all these constraints. Language is not just, in much of literature, the language is the language of the home and the language of the school, but the children mixed it between, they very often spoke, as I also noticed for the Chugoshians, they spoke one language to the parents, but another one to their siblings, for example. So, and people really were the ones making these worlds real for them. So what we saw is that some children became sort of these cultural navigators who actually played with everything they learned, picked up, and used it to their advantage. But others who felt, you know, sooner or later you have to make choices. You're either one or the other. And it's something that is quite bewildering that happened a few weeks ago. I'm not sure whether you read a lot about the Netherlands, but anyway, a few weeks ago in the Netherlands there was this event. There was a jeweler who got robbed, and this jeweler had been robbed before, so there were cameras all in the shop and also in the house, his house, where his wife was watching the camera, and his wife saw that the jewelry shop was just a few blocks down, that was being robbed by two burglars. So by that time they had so much experience with burglaries that they had a gun. So she took a gun, went to the shop, and shot both burglars, unfortunately dead. And what happened afterwards, what turned out, these boys, they were very young, were migrants. That's how it's referred to then. And then, but what was very interesting, what happened was that parents, migrant parents, came out massively and said, we have no connection anymore with our own children. These children have made choices. They have gone for a different trajectory. They look for a place. The school didn't do it for him. We didn't do it. So they look for other avenues of where they can make a living, where they can find a sense of belonging, even if it's with the wrong people. So these parents had lost contact with these boys. These boys became sort of the symbol of this disconnection between parents and children. Yeah, I stopped right away. And the same was happening with the other way around, but you see in secondary school, you see lots of children, migrant children, dropping out of the school system because they feel like the level of education they get is not preparing them for a future as pilots and doctors and all these wonderful things they dreamt of one day. It's not doing it for them simply because they know that when they actually go even for an internship, that their name is not working in their advantage. And although this supposedly is not to happen in the Netherlands, these children are confronted with that. And then they say, what the heck, I'm just not going to school anymore. Why would I do that? So it's this disconnection not only to families, but also to school, the schooling system, and then eking out life for themselves in very different settings. So the huge discussion is now going on in the Netherlands because of this very, very awful event that happened. But parents actually crying out that we have lost contact with these children. And other parents say, like, my son is fighting the jihad now in Syria. And we don't understand why this happens. He never gave a sign that that's what he's going to do. So you see these disconnects everywhere. And although these pilots were so different, we saw this underlying dynamic of children having difficulty of bringing all these worlds together and finding not to get squeezed in between all of them. And showing unhinging, not just, lots of research is targeted at the secondary level, where you see it happening in terms of them actually falling out of the education system. But the first signs were clearly there already in primary school, where children already feel like there is a disconnect. And it's difficult to connect these different places. And that's exactly what we're trying to map, like where do children find these disconnects and how do they think about it? And what are assets that children can mobilize upon in order to be able to deal with these differences? So it's not an either or, which is many of them seem to think. I had to put down learning outcomes for the abstract, so I thought that I hope these are some of the learning outcomes. At least I must say we as researchers learned a lot, simply by putting the questionnaire aside, I should say actually. But through the children, with the children, and thanks to the children. So yeah, I think I stop there. Thank you.